The cold steel of the binoculars felt like ice against General Hanns von Kluge's face. It was 4:30 a.m. on the morning of June 6, 1944, and the sky over the Normandy coast was a bruised, pre-dawn purple. Below his command bunker at Château de la Roche-Guyon, the Seine River flowed silently, a dark ribbon separating him from the rumored storm gathering in England. He lowered the glasses. Nothing. Just the endless, choppy gray of the English Channel and the faint, salty tang of the sea air. "They will come at Calais," he murmured to his aide, Major Reichhelm, who stood stiffly beside him. "The Pas-de-Calais. It is the logical choice. The shortest crossing, the best ports. Patton is there. The first United States Army group is there. All of our intelligence confirms it." His voice was a low, confident rumble, the sound of a man who had read the same reassuring reports for months. The Atlantic Wall, that sprawling, often mocked network of fortifications stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, was strongest here, in the 15th Army's sector. Here, the beaches were sown with millions of mines, studded with jagged hedgehogs and tetrahedra, and covered by the interlocking fire of massive 88 and 155 guns emplaced in concrete casemates so thick they were considered invulnerable to naval bombardment. The 352nd Infantry Division, a solid, experienced unit, was dug in along these bluffs. They were ready. They were waiting. What they were not ready for, what none of them could have conceived, was that the entire premise of their defense was a magnificent, elaborate lie. While von Kluge scanned an empty horizon, believing he held the strategic initiative, over 5,000 ships were already moving through the choppy waters of the Channel, not towards Calais, but towards the beaches of Normandy, a place the German High Command considered a secondary, almost diversionary possibility. The real deception, Operation Fortitude, had worked with a perfection that its British and American architects scarcely dared hope for. The ghost army of General George Patton, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, had pinned down 19 German divisions, including critical panzer reserves, over 150 miles away. The Germans were looking one way and the hammer was about to fall from another. Von Kluge lit a cigarette, the match flare illuminating his sharp, aristocratic features for a moment. "The weather is atrocious. Even if they were mad enough to come here, Rommel was right about one thing. They need low tide and a full moon. They have neither. The forecast is for more of the same. They cannot come in this." He exhaled a plume of smoke that was snatched away by the wind. "This is not their day." He was wrong. It was precisely their day. The very weather he saw as his ally had been used by the Allies as a weapon of surprise. While German meteorologists, relying on limited Atlantic data, predicted continued storms, a team of Allied forecasters, with access to weather stations in Greenland and the mid-Atlantic, had identified a narrow 36-hour window of marginally improved conditions. General Eisenhower had gambled everything on that forecast. The Armada was already at sea. The paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne were already buckling their chutes in the holds of C-47s back in England. The greatest amphibious invasion in human history was not cancelled. It was irrevocably launched, and its target was the one place the German command had deemed least likely. The confidence of the German High Command in the spring of 1944 was not merely arrogance. It was a fortress built brick by brick from a foundation of flawed intelligence, cultural prejudice, and past success. The core of their miscalculation lay in their unwavering belief in the Calais hypothesis. This was not a casual assumption, but a conclusion painstakingly reinforced by one of the most successful strategic deceptions of all time. The Allies, through the London controlling section and a web of double agents, most notably the brilliant Spanish spy codenamed Garbo, had fed the German Abwehr a continuous stream of fabricated intelligence. They spoke of a massive army group, FUSAG, commanded by the formidable General Patton, poised to strike at the Pas-de-Calais. The Germans swallowed it whole. A critical document, A German intelligence assessment dated May 15, 1944, stated categorically, "The concentration of enemy forces in the south and southeast of England confirms that the main enemy landing will be in the area of the Pas-de-Calais. The other areas, in particular Normandy, are only threatened by secondary operations." This was gospel at Hitler's Wolf's Lair and at von Kluge's headquarters. The very geography seemed to confirm it. Calais was just 21 miles from Dover. The crossing was quick. The ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam were the ultimate strategic prize. Normandy, by contrast, was a 100-mile voyage across notoriously rough seas to a coastline with poor ports. It made no strategic sense to the German mind, which valued logic and concentration above all else. This intellectual rigidity was compounded by a deep-seated, racially tinged contempt for American military capability. The memory of the American performance at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in 1943 was still fresh. There, Green USII Corps had been routed by Rommel's Afrika Korps. The German assessment of the American soldier was that he was soft, poorly led, and incapable of the kind of sustained, brutal combat that characterized the Eastern Front. A report from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt to Hitler in early 1944 opined that the Americans were not a martial nation, and that their army was a heterogeneous mass with no inner cohesion. They were seen as technicians and industrialists, not warriors. This prejudice extended to their assessment of Allied technology. German intelligence vastly underestimated the pace of American industrial innovation and production. They knew the Sherman tank, and they derided it as the Tommykooker for its tendency to burn when hit. Their own Tigers and Panthers were superior in almost every technical aspect: armor, gun velocity, and killing power. What they failed to grasp was the concept of volume and reliability. While a German factory might produce one magnificent, over-engineered Tiger, American factories were churning out nearly 50,000 Shermans. Quality, the Germans believed, would always triumph over quantity. They did not yet understand that in a war of attrition, quantity has a quality all its own. Most fatally, they misunderstood the Allied command structure itself. They saw the Anglo-American alliance as a fractious, committee-driven affair, incapable of the bold, unitary decision-making that characterized the German system. They believed the required level of secrecy for an operation of this scale was impossible for the democracies. There would be leaks, there would be dissent, there would be delay. They could not conceive of the iron will and organizational genius of men like Eisenhower, who managed to weld the proud, often rivalrous commands of the Americans and British into a single, cohesive, and terrifyingly efficient instrument of war. But beneath this edifice of confidence, there were cracks. A few lone voices of warning were raised, only to be silenced or ignored. The most prominent of these was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of Army Group B. Having fought the British and Americans in North Africa, he had a much healthier respect for their ingenuity and tenacity. He had spent months desperately strengthening the Atlantic Wall, famously arguing that the battle would be won or lost on the beaches. "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive," he told his staff. "For the Allies as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." He wanted the Panzer divisions, the mobile counterattack force, moved up close to the coast to strike the invaders before they could establish a foothold. He was overruled. Von Rundstedt and Hitler insisted on keeping the Panzers, like the elite 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division, in a central reserve, to be released only upon the Führer's personal order. The debate was not just about tactics. It was about a fundamental disagreement over Allied intentions. Rommel sensed the invasion could come anywhere. The High Command was convinced it must come at Calais. This bureaucratic and strategic paralysis would prove catastrophic. There was another, more subtle warning that went unheeded. In the weeks leading up to June, the French resistance, directed by London, had intensified its sabotage campaign, but with a curious geographical focus. Railway lines, bridges, and communication cables were systematically cut not around Calais, but throughout Normandy and Brittany. German logistics officers filed furious reports about the disruptions. A sharp-eyed analyst at OKW might have noticed the pattern, but the information was filtered through the prism of the Calais assumption. It was dismissed as general partisan activity or a feint to draw attention away from the real target. The very evidence that should have alerted them was instead used to reinforce their misconceptions. The trap was not just set, the victims were actively helping to build it. While the German high command slumbered in its certainty, a storm of men and material was gathering across the channel, a testament to an industrial and organizational miracle that defied all German expectations. The story of the D-Day invasion fleet was one of numbers so vast they bordered on the incomprehensible. The official plan, Operation Neptune, called for the simultaneous landing of over 150,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and 5,000 ships and landing craft on the first day alone. The logistical backbone of this effort was the Mulberry Harbor, one of the most audacious engineering projects in history, a secret so well kept that the Germans never discovered it. The problem was simple and seemingly insurmountable. Normandy had no major ports. The initial landings would have to be over open beaches, but to sustain the invasion, the Allies needed to unload thousands of tons of supplies every day, something impossible without a deep-water port. The German solution to this problem was to fortify the existing ports, like Cherbourg, to the point of being impregnable. The Allied solution was to bring their own ports with them. The concept was born in the mind of Vice Admiral John Hughes Hallett in 1942 after the disastrous Deep Raid. "If we can't capture a port," he reportedly said, "we must take one with us." The idea was considered ludicrous. But by 1943, under the direction of Winston Churchill himself, the project was given top priority. 2 complete artificial harbors, each the size of the port of Dover, were to be built in sections in Britain, towed across the Channel, and assembled off the coast of Normandy. The numbers involved were staggering. The Mulberries required 600,000 tons of concrete, 31,000 tons of steel, and 10,000 workers to construct. They consisted of massive hollow concrete caissons, codenamed Phoenixes, that were to be sunk to form breakwaters, floating steel roadways, the whales, that would rise and fall with the tide, and old merchant ships and concrete blocks, gooseberries, to create an outer protective barrier. The project was so secret that the workers building the components often had no idea what they were for. One engineer, upon seeing the final design, remarked, "It looks like something out of a H.G. Wells novel." But it worked. By early June 1944, the 2 Mulberries, one for the Americans at Omaha Beach, one for the British at Gold Beach, were ready, their components hidden in estuaries and ports along the British coast, waiting for the signal to move. This was just one part of the technological surge that the Germans had failed to anticipate. There were also the funnies, the specialized armored vehicles of the British 79th Armored Division, under the command of the brilliant and unorthodox General Percy Hobart. While German tank design focused on making a better killer, Hobart's focus was on making a tank that could survive the killing zone of the beach. He modified Churchill and Sherman tanks into a bizarre but effective menagerie of machines. The Crab was a Sherman fitted with a rotating drum and chains that flailed the ground ahead of it, detonating mines. The Crocodile was a Churchill that towed a fuel trailer and could shoot a jet of flame over 100 yards. The Aviary, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, carried a massive mortar that could fire a 40-pound flying dustbin charge to demolish concrete bunkers. There were bridging tanks, fascine-carrying tanks for filling in anti-tank ditches, and even duplex-drive DD, swimming Shermans, equipped with a canvas screen and propeller to motor themselves ashore. The Germans, expecting a straightforward infantry assault followed by tanks landing from craft, had no tactical doctrine to counter such specialized and unexpected weapons. The production figures for the overall invasion were a silent rebuke to German industrial pride. In the United States, the arsenal of democracy was hitting its full, terrifying stride. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,318 aircraft, more than Germany produced in the entire war from 1939 to 1945. They built 17,000 tanks and 77 merchant ships. The landing craft, the unglamorous workhorses of the invasion, were produced in their tens of thousands. The LSD landing ship tank, a crucial vessel, was being launched at a rate of one every 4 days. This was not just an army crossing the channel. It was the physical manifestation of an entire nation's economic and industrial power, a force the German military mind, still rooted in concepts of martial quality, simply could not compute. The final piece of the puzzle was air power. The Germans knew the Allies had air superiority, but they believed it would be largely ineffective against their hardened fortifications. They were wrong. The Allied air forces had developed a sophisticated system of tactical bombing designed to isolate the battlefield. In the months leading up to D-Day, the transportation plan systematically destroyed bridges, railways, and marshalling yards across northern France, crippling the German ability to reinforce the invasion front. On the night of June 5th, this campaign reached its crescendo. While the German Naval Command in Paris dismissed radar contacts of the invasion fleet as a ghost fleet caused by atmospheric conditions, over 13,000 Allied aircraft were sortied to support the landings. The Luftwaffe, which had once terrorized the skies of Europe, could muster barely 300 serviceable fighters to oppose them. The sky, quite literally, belonged to the Allies. The first, fragmented signs that this was not a normal night began to trickle in shortly after midnight. The reports were confused, contradictory, and initially dismissed by higher commands steeped in the Calais delusion. At 0:15 a.m., the German 716th Infantry Division near Caen reported paratroopers landing east of the Orne River. The duty officer at the 84th Corps headquarters was skeptical. Probably a supply drop for the resistance, he noted, or crewmen from a downed bomber. But then another report came in, then another, from St. Miraglais, from the marshes at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, from near Pegasus Bridge. The maps at German headquarters began to bristle with pins. The drops seemed scattered, disorganized. To General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, it initially appeared to be a series of small, diversionary raids, designed to cause chaos while the main attack prepared to cross at Calais. He telephoned General Hanss, Rommel's Chief of Staff, at La Roche-Guyon. Rommel himself was in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday and intending to meet with Hitler the next day to plead for more panzers. "General," Pemsel said, his voice tight, "we have multiple confirmed reports of parachute and glider landings across the Cotentin and east of the Orne. The volume suggests this is more than a raid. I believe this is a large-scale airborne operation." Spadel, calm and academic, was unconvinced. "The main effort will be at Calais, Max. This is likely a deception. Keep me informed." The order went out to local units. Contain and eliminate the paratroopers. No general alarm was raised. The precious panzer divisions remained in their barracks, their engines cold. The next wave of reports was even more confusing. Naval stations along the coast began reporting heavy, sustained engine noises out in the channel. The radar station at Cherbourg was jammed by a sudden, overwhelming electronic fog. A few forward observation posts reported seeing dark shapes on the water, vast and innumerable. A young lieutenant with a coastal battery near Utah Beach telephoned his battalion commander. "Sir, the channel, it's full of ships. I've never seen anything like it." The battalion commander, roused from his bed, snorted, "Nonsense, it's probably a fishing fleet, or the weather is playing tricks on you. Go back to your post." He hung up and went back to sleep. The most telling failure of German intelligence occurred in the early hours of June 6th. Around 2 a.m., the 352nd Infantry Division, stationed at Omaha Beach, intercepted a fragment of an American radio transmission. It was a message to the French resistance, part of the prearranged BBC broadcast system. The message was the second line of a Verlaine poem, Blessant mon cœur d'une langueur monotone, wound my heart with a monotonous languor. This was the signal that meant the invasion would begin within 48 hours. The intelligence officer who decoded it immediately sent a warning up the chain of command. It arrived on the desk of a staff officer at the 15th Army headquarters in Calais. He read it, shrugged, and filed it away. The 15th Army was on high alert for the real invasion at Calais. A message about an invasion in the 7th Army sector in Normandy was someone else's problem. It was a bureaucratic error born of a strategic obsession, and it would cost thousands of German lives. The very machine designed to process information had been wired to reject anything that contradicted its core programming. As the night wore on, the evidence became impossible for even the most skeptical to ignore. General Pemsel, piecing together the reports from his command post in Le Mans, became increasingly agitated. The paratroopers were not just raiders. They were seizing key bridges and road junctions. The reports of ships were coming from too many independent sources to be a collective hallucination. At 4:30 a.m. he made another, more urgent call to Spadel. "Hands, this is it," Pemsel insisted, his voice stripped of all doubt. "The long-range naval guns are engaging targets along the coast. The reports of ships are confirmed. This is not a diversion. This is the invasion. I am convinced the main effort is here in Normandy." This time Spadel hesitated. The evidence was mounting. He agreed to alert von Rundstedt's headquarters, Ob West. The great, slumbering German military bureaucracy began to stir, but with agonizing slowness. Requests were sent to release the Panzer reserves. They landed on the desk of General Alfred Jodl at OKW, Hitler's headquarters. Jodl, refusing to wake the Führer and adhering rigidly to the doctrine that the main attack must be at Calais, denied the request. The Panzers, the one force that could have driven the Allies into the sea on that first, critical day, remained motionless. The door of opportunity was slamming shut, and the Germans were still fumbling for the key. Dawn on June 6, 1944, did not break so much as it leaked into the sky, a thin, gray light that did little to lift the gloom over the Normandy coast. For the men of the German 352nd Infantry Division dug into the bluffs above Omaha Beach. The first sight of the Armada was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror that transcended all their training and propaganda. Corporal Henrik Naumann, manning an MG-42 in a concrete nest codenamed Widerstandsnest 62, was the first in his squad to see it. He had been peering through his artillery periscope, scanning the horizon for the source of the ever-loudening naval gunfire that had been shaking his bunker for an hour. Then the morning mist parted for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. The entire horizon from east to west as far as he could see was a solid, unbroken line of ships, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stood offshore, their big guns flashing like distant lightning. Closer in, the sea was choked with an incredible mass of landing craft, Higgins boats, LSDs, churning toward the beach in endless, methodical waves. It was a sight so vast, so overwhelming, that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. The sea itself had been replaced by steel. "Mein Gott," he whispered, the words barely audible over the roar of a nearby 88 gun. "The whole world is coming." His squad leader, a veteran of the Russian front, grabbed the periscope. He looked for a long, silent 10 seconds, his face draining of all color. He had seen Soviet human wave attacks, the massed panzers at Kursk, but he had never seen anything like this. This was not an army, it was a geological event. He picked up the field telephone, his hand trembling slightly. "Command post, this is WN-62, the enemy fleet. It is beyond description. The entire channel is covered. Estimate at least 5,000 vessels. They are heading directly for our sector." Over, the voice that crackled back was disbelieving. "WN-62, confirm your estimate. 5,000. That is impossible. Check your observation." "Sir, I am looking at it. It is not 5,000, it is more. They are everywhere." The initial naval bombardment that followed was an experience that redefined the concept of firepower for every German soldier who survived it. The battleships Texas and Arkansas, along with a host of cruisers and destroyers, began systematically working over the beach defenses. Shells from their 14-inch and 12-inch guns, weighing as much as a small car, screamed overhead and detonated with world-ending force. The bluffs above Omaha Beach erupted in a continuous, rolling thunder of explosions. Geysers of earth and concrete shot hundreds of feet into the air. The very ground shook as if in an earthquake. Inside the bunkers, the German defenders were thrown about like dolls. The concussion from near misses was physically painful, rattling teeth and stunning eardrums. Dust and cordite smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. A young loader for a 75 anti-tank gun began weeping uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the sheer, sensory-overloading violence of it all. The communications wires to many of the forward positions were cut within the first 10 minutes. The carefully plotted fields of interlocking fire were disrupted as machine gun nests were buried and gun emplacements shattered. Then, at 6:30 a.m., the bombardment lifted and shifted inland. A sudden, eerie silence fell over the beach, broken only by the crackle of flames and the moaning of the wounded. Through the smoke, the Germans saw the first wave of landing craft, dozens of them, heading straight for the shore. They were still 1,000 yards out. The order was given along the German line: "Stand to, wait for them, wait until they are in the water." The first LCVPS landing craft vehicle personnel hit the sandbars and dropped their ramps. The doors slammed down into the chest-deep, freezing water. And then the killing zone of Omaha Beach erupted. From hidden positions that had survived the bombardment, machine guns opened up, their tracers stitching lethal lines across the water. Mortar rounds began walking through the waves. The 88 and 75 guns, zeroed in on the beach exits, started firing with methodical precision. The first American soldiers to leap from the boats were cut down in seconds. The sea began to turn pink, then red. Men laden with heavy equipment drowned when they stepped into deep water. Others were hit as they waded ashore, their bodies piling up at the water's edge. The planned assault bogged down into a bloody, chaotic slaughter. From their vantage points, the German defenders felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Their defenses were holding. The armies were being butchered. The reports going back to the command posts were optimistic, enemy landing attempt being repulsed with heavy losses. But then, something began to change. The initial, shocked paralysis of the American troops began to wear off. Small, isolated groups of survivors, pinned down behind the scant cover of a sandbank or the iron check hedgehogs, started to fight back. They were leaderless, disorganized, but they were not broken. A handful of brave junior officers and NCOs began to rally their men. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the wire. They began to work their way, inch by bloody inch, up the draws that led off the beach. And then the funnies began to arrive, or at least, the few that had survived the treacherous swim. A DD Sherman, its flotation screen shredded by gunfire, managed to crawl onto the sand and began engaging a German machine gun nest with its 75 gun. The effect was instantaneous. The bunker, impervious to small arms fire, was shattered by the high-explosive shell. For the first time, the Germans facing Omaha Beach were facing direct tank fire. Simultaneously, at the other landing beaches, the story was unfolding with different but equally shocking results. At Utah Beach, The landing had gone almost miraculously well, the currents having serendipitously deposited the assault force on a less defended stretch of coast. The British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword were fighting their way inland, supported by the specialized Hobart's funnies, which were proving devastatingly effective against the German defenses. The crocodile flamethrowers were clearing out strongpoints with horrific efficiency, the crabs were detonating minefields, and the AVREs were blasting bunkers to rubble. The reports flooding into the German command posts were no longer just about repulsing a landing. They were about breakthroughs. Local counterattacks by German infantry were being thrown back with heavy losses. The paratroopers, though scattered, had seized their key objectives and were wreaking havoc in the German rear areas, cutting communication lines and ambushing reinforcements. By 8 a.m., the reality of the situation was beginning to dawn on the German high command. This was not a raid. This was not a diversion. The scale was too vast, the commitment too total. The phone at von Rundstedt's headquarters rang incessantly. It was Pemsel from the 7th Army, his voice cracking with strain. Field Marshal, we are engaged along the entire coast of Normandy. The enemy is ashore at 5, possibly 6 points. We have lost contact with several coastal strongpoints. We need the panzers. We need them now. Von Rundstedt, the old aristocrat, finally grasped the truth. The Calais hypothesis was a phantom. The entire strategic picture he had built his defense upon had just collapsed. He authorized the release of the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr divisions. But the order had to be confirmed by OKW. Precious hours had already been lost. The panzers would have to fight their way to the coast through a maelstrom of Allied fighter-bombers that owned the sky. Aboard the USS Augusta, the American command ship cruising off Omaha Beach, General Omar Bradley stared through his binoculars at the smoke-shrouded shoreline. The reports coming in were grim. The V-Corps assault was in danger of stalling completely. Casualties were estimated to be catastrophic. For a terrible hour, he considered the unthinkable, diverting all further reinforcements from the disaster at Omaha to the other beaches. The entire American landing was in the balance. But then, through the smoke and chaos, he began to see small, flickering signs of hope. Tiny groups of men were moving. They were not retreating. They were advancing. They were climbing the bluffs. Using grenades and bayonets and raw courage, they were starting to clear the German positions from the flanks. A lone destroyer, the USS McCook, ignoring the risk of running aground, sailed so close to the beach that its keel scraped bottom and began pumping 5-inch shells directly into the German pillboxes at point-blank range. The battle for Omaha Beach had degenerated into hundreds of small, savage, close-quarter fights for each bunker, each trench, each draw. It was no longer a coordinated military operation, but a brutal test of individual and small unit will. The American soldier, whom the Germans had derided as soft and undisciplined, was proving to be tenacious, resourceful, and ferociously brave. Back at Widerstandsnest 62, Corporal Naumann's MG-42 was overheating, its barrel glowing a dull red. He had fired thousands of rounds. The bodies of American soldiers were piled in front of his position, but they kept coming. They were no longer wading through the water in orderly lines. They were crawling, running, darting from cover to cover. He saw one man, a lieutenant, stand up fully exposed to throw a grenade into a machine gun nest. He was hit multiple times but still managed to throw it before he fell. Naumann felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. This was not what he had been told. These were not the weak-willed soldiers of the intelligence reports. These men fought with a desperate, terrifying fury. His ammunition was running low. The men on either side of him were dead. He looked through a slit in the concrete and saw a new wave of landing craft approaching the shore. And then he saw something else, something that made his blood run cold. Cutting through the smoke, coming straight for his position, was a Sherman tank, one of the swimming ones. Its canvas screen collapsed and hanging like a shredded skirt, but its 75 gun very much alive and swiveling towards his bunker. He had just enough time to scream "Panzer" before the world dissolved in noise and flame. The shell struck the embrasure, not a direct hit, but close enough. The concussion was a physical blow, slamming Naumann against the rear wall of the bunker. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, drowning out all other sound. Dust and smoke choked the air, thick and acrid. When his vision cleared, he saw the machine gun was a twisted wreck, and the two other men in the position were dead, their bodies torn by shrapnel. Staggering to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, he grabbed his Carmenes 98,000 rifle and stumbled out of the shattered bunker into the trench line behind it. The beach below was a scene from hell. The smoke was so thick he could barely see the water, but he could hear the relentless crackle of small arms fire, the crump of mortars, and the desperate shouts of men in two languages. The Americans were no longer on the beach. They were in the bluffs. They were among them. This was the critical failure of the German defense at Omaha. The bombardment, while failing to destroy many of the hardened emplacements, had severed the intricate network of communication trenches and telephone lines connecting the wider Stanznissen. Each strongpoint was now an isolated fortress, fighting its own private war, unable to coordinate fire or call for support. The American infantry, those who had survived the initial slaughter, were exploiting these dead zones, these blind spots between the fields of fire. They were not attacking the bunkers head-on. They were climbing the steep, seemingly impassable gullies on the flanks, using ropes and bayonets as pitons, and attacking them from the sides and rear. Naumann joined a handful of other dazed survivors from adjacent positions, a mix of soldiers from the 352nd and the static 716th Division. They were led by a grizzled sergeant named Klaus Fischer, a man with a frozen Stalingrad wound in his leg that gave him a permanent limp. "Forget the beach," Fischer roared, his voice raspy from smoke and exertion. "They're in the draws. They're behind us. Form a skirmish line here. Stop them from reaching the crest." The battle had devolved from a coordinated defense into a savage, close-quarters melee in the scrub and gorse of the bluffs. 100 yards to the east, a similar drama was playing out. Lieutenant John Spaulding of Company E, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, had managed to lead a remnant of his platoon, just over 20 men, up a narrow, heavily defended draw later to be known as Easy Red. Using grenades and a single, precious bazooka round, they had silenced a key machine gun nest that had been pinning down the entire center of the beach. Now they were on the high ground looking down at the carnage they had escaped. Spaulding, a quiet man from Kentucky, felt no sense of triumph, only a cold, hollow exhaustion. He could see the landing craft still coming in, the men still dying in the water. His job was not over. He pointed inland, towards a cluster of stone houses and a network of trenches that constituted the village of Calville-sur-Mer. "That way," he said, his voice flat. "We have to clear those trenches and secure the exit." His men, their faces smeared with soot and sweat, nodded grimly. They had crossed the threshold of fear into a state of numb, automatic resolve. They were the spearpoint, and they had to keep pushing. This microcosm of the battle at Omaha was being replicated across the entire invasion front. The grand strategy of fortitude, the industrial miracle of the mulberries, the technological innovation of the funnies, all of it now boiled down to the courage of individual soldiers like Spaulding and the desperation of defenders like Naumann. The outcome of D-Day, and perhaps the war in Europe, hinged on thousands of such small, brutal encounters in the hedgerows and villages of Normandy. While the crisis at Omaha unfolded, the broader strategic paralysis at the highest levels of the German command entered its most critical phase. At La Roche-Guyon, Major Reichhelm burst into the map room without knocking, his usual composure shattered. "General von Kluge, a dispatch from the 7th Army. The enemy is ashore in force at 5 separate beaches. They have established footholds everywhere. Omaha is still contested, but the British and Canadians are pushing inland at a frightening speed. They are reporting specialized armor we have no counter for." Von Kluge stood over the situation map, his face a stony mask. The pins representing Allied landings were no longer speculative. They were confirmed, solid. The Calais hypothesis, the intellectual cornerstone of his defense, lay in ruins around him. The magnitude of the deception was staggering. He had been played for a fool. "The Panzers," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Where are the Panzers? Ob West has authorized their release, Herr General, but OKW must confirm. General Jodl has refused to wake the Führer. The orders are stalled." A vein throbbed in von Kluge's temple. The bureaucratic insanity of it was going to cost them the war. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, fanatical boys led by hardened NCOs, was stationed near Lycia, less than 50 miles from the coast. The Panzer Lehr, perhaps the most powerful division in the entire German army, was near Chartres. They could have been on the move at dawn, crushing the vulnerable beachheads before the Allies could unload their artillery and consolidate. Now, it was nearly 9 a.m. The Allies had been ashore for over 2 hours. The sky was black with their aircraft. "Get me Spadel," he snapped. "Then get me von Rundstedt. This is no longer a debate. This is a catastrophe." The conversation that followed was a study in fractured command. Von Rundstedt in Paris was finally in agreement. He saw the threat with crystalline clarity, but his hands were tied by the man in the wolf's lair. Hitler, the ultimate architect of the Calais delusion, was still asleep, his staff too terrified to disturb him. The German war machine, so feared for its speed and aggression, was hamstrung by its own top-heavy, sycophantic command structure. The precious hours of the morning, when a concentrated panzer counterstrike might have had a chance, slipped away minute by minute. It was not until nearly 4 p.m. that afternoon that a groggy Hitler was finally briefed on the invasion. His reaction, filtered through the lens of his own dogma, was a masterpiece of self-deception. He initially greeted the news with jubilation. "Finally," he is reported to have exclaimed. "They are in the open. Now we have them where we can destroy them. This is not the main attack. The main attack will still come at Calais." He refused to release the full panzer reserves from the 15th Army, still convinced it was a trap. The orders that finally went out to the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr were too little, too late. They were to move to the coast and contain the beachhead. A decisive counteroffensive to throw the Allies into the sea was never seriously considered by the High Command on June 6. The opportunity born of surprise and confusion was gone forever. The reality on the ground for the German armored units was a nightmare. The commander of the 12th SS, Kurt Meyer, known as Panzermeier, a bold and aggressive leader, immediately grasped the urgency. He ordered his units to move out at once, without waiting for the full division to assemble. But the journey to the coast became a gauntlet of death. The Allied air forces owned the sky. The Jabos, the German nickname for the fighter-bombers, were everywhere. Every road, every bridge, every crossroads was a potential kill zone. Meyer, riding in his command vehicle at the head of a battalion of Mark IV tanks, saw his division being dismantled piecemeal before it even made contact with the enemy. A flight of British Typhoons would swoop down out of the sun, their rocket projectiles streaking towards the column with a terrifying whoosh. A tank would erupt in a fireball, blocking the road. Then the machine gunning would start, raking the soft-skinned vehicles and the men caught in the open. The march was a stop-start affair of taking cover, clearing wreckage, and trying to move again. The vaunted Panzer Lehr, a division equipped with the latest Panther and Tiger tanks, suffered a similar fate. Its commander later reported that his division lost 5 times as many vehicles to air attack on June 6 than it did to enemy tanks in the following weeks. The Allied transportation plan had worked perfectly. The German reinforcements were arriving late, piecemeal, and battered. As the sun began its slow descent in the late afternoon of June 6, the battle entered a new, grinding phase. The Allies were desperately working to consolidate their separate beachheads into a continuous front. The Americans from Omaha and Utah needed to link up, as did the British and Canadians at Gold, Juno, and Sword. For the Germans, the mission was to prevent this at all costs, to hold the Allies in a narrow, constricted perimeter where naval gunfire could not reach as effectively, and where their own artillery could inflict maximum casualties. In the bloody draws above Omaha, the fighting reached a new peak of ferocity. The 12th SS, what elements of it that had arrived, began a series of furious counterattacks against the vulnerable American positions around Calvel-sur-Mer and St. Lawrence-sur-Mer. These were not the hesitant, poorly coordinated attacks of the morning, but violent, well-executed assaults by elite, motivated troops. The Hitlerjugend Division, true to its name, fought with a fanaticism that shocked the battle-weary American infantry. They were young, some only 16 or 17 years old, but they were superbly trained and indoctrinated with a Nazi fervor that made them fearlessly reckless. Corporal Naumann, now attached to a ragged Kampfgruppe of survivors from the 352nd, found himself fighting alongside a squad of these SS boys. They moved with a confident aggression he found both impressive and frightening. They didn't dig in, they attacked. As dusk began to settle, they launched a determined push to retake the draw that Lieutenant Spaulding had so tenuously secured. The fighting was house to house, trench to trench. Grenades arced through the smoky air. The crump of mortar shells and the staccato rip of the MG-42s and the slower, heavier reply of the American Bars created a deafening symphony of violence. Naumann found himself in the ruins of a stone barn, trading shots with an American squad across a manure-strewn courtyard. He saw one of the SS boys, a fair-haired youth who couldn't have been more than 17, stand up and charge the American position with a machine pistol, screaming "Heil Hitler!" He was cut down before he took 3 steps. Another, wielding a Panzerfaust, managed to knock out a Sherman tank that had pushed too far ahead of its infantry support. The tank brewed up, its ammunition cooking off in a series of pops and bangs, illuminating the twilight with a ghastly orange glow. It was in this chaotic close-quarters battle that the American soldiers' tenacity truly began to tell. They were not fanatics, but they were stubborn. They held their ground with a grim, unyielding determination. Lieutenant Spaulding, his uniform torn and his helmet dented by a piece of shrapnel, organized a defense using the rubble of a farmhouse as a strongpoint. He had no radio contact with his company, little ammunition, and a third of his men were wounded. But they held. They repulsed 3 separate assaults, their Moen Garans and their single Browning automatic rifle laying down a lethal field of fire. The American ability to generate rapid, accurate rifle fire, the 1 minute of fire doctrine, proved devastating in these defensive actions. The German MP-40 submachine guns were excellent for assault, but they were outranged and outgunned by the semi-automatic Garans. As full darkness finally fell over Normandy, a strange, uneasy quiet descended on the battlefield, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the sporadic crack of a sniper's rifle. The fires from burning buildings and vehicles cast a flickering, infernal light over the landscape. The smell was a nauseating cocktail of cordite, blood, diesel fuel, and death. On the bluffs above Omaha, the Americans had secured a precarious foothold, a strip of land barely a mile deep in some places. The cost had been astronomical. Over 2,000 men had been killed, wounded, or missing on that one beach alone. But they were there. They had accomplished what the German High Command had believed impossible. They had stormed the strongest part of the Atlantic Wall and survived. Out in the Channel, the second, even more incredible phase of the invasion was beginning. As the German commanders focused on the fighting ashore, they failed to grasp the true, revolutionary nature of the threat they faced. The Mulberry harbors were on the move. Tugboats, working through the night, began the Herculean task of towing the massive Phoenix caissons, the floating roadways, and the block ships across the channel. It was an operation of mind-boggling complexity and audacity. To the few German observers who saw the strange, slow-moving convoys, they were incomprehensible, dismissed as perhaps a follow-on supply operation. The concept of a portable harbor was so alien to German military thinking that it never registered as a threat. Yet, within days, these artificial ports would begin operating, allowing the Allies to pour men and material onto the continent at a rate the Germans could never hope to match. Aboard the USS Augusta, General Omar Bradley finally received a report that allowed him to breathe again. The situation at Omaha had stabilized. The beach exits were open. Reinforcements were flowing inland. The crisis had passed. He looked haggard, the weight of the day's decisions etched deeply into his face. He had come within a hair's breadth of abandoning Omaha. The courage of the men on the beach, men like Spaulding and his platoon, had saved the invasion from a potentially fatal failure. Back at La Roche-Guyon, the mood was funereal. The reports that filtered in throughout the evening painted a picture of unmitigated disaster. The Allies were firmly ashore on a front of nearly 50 miles. The airborne divisions had largely achieved their objectives, cutting key roads and sowing chaos. The Panzer counterattacks had been delayed, disrupted, and defeated. The Luftwaffe was a non-factor. General von Kluge sat alone in his office, the map spread before him now meaningless. The confidence of the morning was a distant, bitter memory. He now understood the full, brilliant, and terrifying scope of the Allied deception. He had been outthought and outfought. He picked up the phone and requested a secure line to Field Marshal von Rundstedt. "The situation is critical," von Kluge said, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance. "The enemy has achieved complete tactical surprise. His air superiority is absolute. Our mobile reserves have been unable to intervene decisively. The coastal defenses have been breached in multiple locations. I must report that the first day has been a severe reversal." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then von Rundstedt's voice, old and tired, came through. "It is worse than a reversal, Hanss. It is the beginning of the end. We have lost the battle for the coast. Now we must fight a battle for which we are not prepared, a battle of attrition against an enemy who commands the sea and the air. The longest day, Rommel was right, and it is over. We have lost it." In a muddy field near St. Miraglais, Private John Steele of the 82nd Airborne, whose parachute had caught on the church steeple, forcing him to play dead for hours, was finally cut down by German soldiers who had taken him prisoner. As he was marched away, he saw the endless streams of C-47s and gliders filling the sky, bringing in the reinforcements and heavy equipment. The air throbbed with the sound of their engines, a sound of inexorable power and resolve. In his bunker at Widerstandsnest 62, now abandoned and littered with spent casings and the detritus of battle, a single, untouched picture postcard of the Rhine River lay on the floor, trampled by muddy boots. Outside, the tide came in, slowly, relentlessly, washing over the bodies of the fallen, both American and German. The sea, which had been a highway of invasion, was now a grave. But the battle for Normandy had only just begun. The storm that General von Kluge had failed to see coming had not just arrived. It had made landfall, and it would not stop until it had swept across the entire continent, washing away the Third Reich in its path. The longest day was over, but the war for everyone had entered its final, bloody act. The door to Fortress Europe had been kicked in, and there was no force on earth that could ever close it again.